Welcome to Moveable Dough. This is Steve Danielson. I'm a composer, conductor, and music educator. On this podcast, I talk with other composers and discover how they began their journey into composition. Join me each week as we explore their lives, their musical journeys, and of course, their music. To learn more about this podcast and access a complete archive of episodes, including the series of shorter segments called Movable Snippets, visit my website at sdcompose.com/movabledough. Hey, this is Steve. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Moveable Dough. My guest today is Dr. Lawrence Kramer. Lawrence is a distinguished professor of English and music at Fordham University. He is an author, a prize-winning composer, and the director of Fordham's Voices Up concert series. His works cover a broad spectrum, including song cycles, standalone songs, piano music, string quartets, chamber music, choral songs, and orchestral works. Lawrence was educated at the University of Pennsylvania and Yale, and he has held 10 visiting professorships in North America, Europe, and China. Lawrence Kramer, welcome to Moveable Dough.
Thank you, Steve. I'm very pleased to be here.
All right. Well, I'm excited to have you on the program. You made your Moveable Dough debut back in July when your piece Cloud Shadows was featured as a movable snippet. So I'm excited to to know more about you today. So let's go back to your beginnings. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Philadelphia.
Okay.
Yeah.
So not terribly far away from where you are now.
No, in fact, I moved to New York City when I was 15. And in between Philadelphia and New York, I was living in a New Jersey suburb, which at the time was brand new and very raw and had exactly zero culture. So I found myself at the age of 15 deposited in New York City, and it saved me. I mean, it was like everything was available, and I started to take advantage of everything. And for better or worse, this was long enough ago that at the time, Lincoln Center was being constructed.
Oh, wow.
And so in my late teenage years and early college years, I was around for the very beginnings of Lincoln Center. And I went to what was then, I guess, called Philharmonic Hall quite frequently. I heard Bernstein conduct a lot. And who knew that I would end up spending over 40 years teaching at that very location.
Yeah.
But that's where I am, at the Lincoln Center campus of Fordham.
So just out of curiosity, have you seen the new version of West Side Story that sort of centers around the building of Lincoln Center?
I have not. I've read about it, but
Okay.
it sounds like something we'll have to see. And then, of course, there's this new biopic about
Bernstein.
About Bernstein. So
Yeah.
that clearly be something to catch up with when I get a chance.
Sure. So just out of curiosity, what is your earliest musical memory? Thinking back as far as you can.
Well, that's an easy one because my earliest musical memory has been vivid for these many years. It turns out that in the basement of my grandparents' house in Philadelphia, in Northeast Philadelphia, was an old Victrola, a wind-up Victrola, and a small selection of 78 RPM records. And when I was a boy of about 4, 5, 6, I can't date it exactly, I discovered this machine and asked my grandparents, well, how do you work it? And they told me. And so I was picking up platters and putting my head in the horn and listening to what was being offered. And the piece that struck me forcibly at the time, and it's funny because I just taught a class about this, was Rimsky-Korsakov Scheherazade.
Okay.
And so that particular pair of themes, there was the dark, brooding opening and then the violin theme, that was my introduction, not really to classical music, but in a way to music. And it just kind of got into my DNA.
That is quite the introduction. So did you end up taking lessons as a child as well? Piano lessons or other things?
To take piano lessons for some time as a child. Had to stop when I moved to New York because the piano couldn't come with us. And was not really able to pick up till quite some years later. And so my skills as a pianist were never great. And I don't play much anymore.
Okay. So Sort of a related question. What sort of music were you listening to as a teenager? What was on the radio?
Well, now that's an interesting question. I guess what was on the radio, what was then the New York Times classical music station, WQXR.
Okay.
I'm a fan. But even more than that, when I was a kid, I would go to the library, which existed at 53rd Street and Fifth Avenue. It was called the Donnell Library. It no longer exists. And they had a huge collection of LPs. And I would go borrow these LPs and bring them home and play them. I really was hooked on classical music from a very early age, and actually only caught up with other forms when I was grown up. First, what everybody else does, right?
Sure. So did you always plan on being a musician, or did you have other thoughts when you were younger?
Well, that actually is another. I mean, I like to tell this story, so I'll tell it briefly now. But if you look at my official title at Fordham, I'm a distinguished professor of English and music.
Right.
And those two things were in intense competition for me when I was in college. And I had mentors in both fields urging me to follow that particular path. So it was really quite a hard decision to make. Ultimately, I decided to get a PhD in English because I did have a kind of desire to write music, and I had sufficient training to be able to do it. But at the time and place, this was the University of Pennsylvania in the 1960s, the only kind of music that had any respectability or was even tolerated by the people who were my teachers and mentors was post-war serialism.
Hmm.
And although I found many things to be intellectually interested in, I learned a lot about various possibilities. It's not the kind of music I wanted to write. But it turned out that if you wanted to write anything else, you were a pariah. And so that kind of tipped the scales. I went off and studied literature instead. And then, music got me back after I had earned my PhD. Interestingly enough, returned to Penn as an English professor for a few years, but could not keep away from music. And the real die was cast when my wife's mother, who was downsizing from her apartment in Chicago, called up one day and said, "I have nowhere to put our piano. Would you like it?" That was the beginning of the first phase of my career.
That's awesome. Well, speaking of phases of your careers, you sort of talk about your composer career coming in
Mhm.
two waves, sort of interrupted by 15 years of work as a musicologist. So I'd love to hear about these two different waves of composition.
Sure, yes. I was coming into the composition world without the usual network of connections because I had professionally situated myself in the world of literary studies. So although I was enjoying myself composing certain things, I was also finding it extremely difficult to get performances.
Mm-hmm.
And after a goodly number of years of that, a nice thing happened, which is that my second book, which is called Music as Cultural Practice, was published in 1990. And it was a hit. So I got drawn more and more into the musicological world, became very, very busy as a musicologist, and just gradually let the composition go because I was being both intellectually stimulated and also rewardingly successful in the musicological world. Many years later, that actually had an unlooked for benefit because after, that 15 years or so had gone by, I was actually pretty well known as a musicologist and knew a lot of people in music, new musicians. And so opportunities to compose came up.
Uh-huh.
I was, one in particular was the kind of turning point of crystallization. I was having a chat with a new friend at the time. We've been friends ever since, a baritone named Michael Halliwell. And Michael had written a book about opera based on the novels of Henry James. And we were just talking, and wondering if anybody had ever, written song cycles or songs based on anything in James. You have to set prose, but people do that. Neither one of us could think of it. And he, who knew that I had composed all those years ago, said, well, if you'll write something, I'll perform it.
Oh, there you go.
There I went. So I wrote it, he performed it, and I had such a good time. It was such a wonderful experience all around that I basically said, well, this is what I'm going to do in musicology, no matter what happens. And so there it was. The rest, I would like to think, is history.
There you go. So it seems like your work as a musicologist sort of brought you back to composition, which I think is great. Yeah. So I would actually like to turn to your work as a musicologist. I thought it was interesting when I Googled you to do research for the podcast. One of the results was the question, what is Kramer music theory? So I think you're my first guest with a theoretical concept named after them.
So I've never heard of that. That's great.
So you lay out this idea in your book, Music as Cultural Practices, that you mentioned earlier. I read through some of the excerpts from your book. I didn't have time to read the entire book and didn't quite understand everything I was reading on first read. But if I understand correctly, and you can correct me, so you argue that music has connection to the interpretation of literature and cultural practices, and thus becomes a reflection of the times in which they were written. Am I far off, or can you explain more?
Yeah, I'll be happy to explain more. You're not far off.
Okay.
The way in which I conceived of this particular musicological initiative, in which I was not by any means alone, because around the beginning of the 1990s, a good number of people who became, in fact, friends and colleagues of mine were interested in expanding the standard frame of reference for musical study. And as I think you probably know, but I'll just say this, the way in which music was approached was very much concentrated on the one hand, the provision of historical documentation, facts, the elaboration of context on the one hand, and the analysis of or critique of musical form on the other. And musical form is understood to be essentially disconnected from the wider social and cultural world. I and these colleagues of mine, people like Susan McClary, Richard Leppert, Rose Subotnick, basically thought that was all wrong, that there was nothing more connected to the social and cultural world than music, that it was very rich in meanings of the kind that people in the humanities were eager to study. And we would be working together to figure out how we could bring our understanding of music. And, we're all trained, so we all understand about musical form. And of course, as a composer, you've got to be very attentive to that, right? But we wanted to basically make musicology a branch of the humanities. And putting it that way is, I think, important in part because back, I think in the early 90s, maybe in the late 80s, but I have to check, a quite distinguished musicologist named Harold Powers wrote an essay in which he stated very firmly that musicology was not one of the humanities, precisely because of the specialist training and formalistic orientation of musical study. And so our collective project was to say, if we are willing to be risky and experimental, or risky to make statements about music that might once have been regarded as merely subjective, unprovable, we can in fact create responsible an understanding of music which embraces its social, philosophical, cultural, historical dimensions and hear those things in the music, or at least make it possible. One very important part of that initiative is that we never wanted to say that such ideas or such connections had to be heard in the music, or that this is the way you should listen to it. Telling people how they should listen to classical music has been ruinous for decades and decades. If you're interested, this is available. Try it out. You might like the results. And of course, there's always the possibility that you and I would hear something quite differently. And that's not a bad thing. That's an excellent thing because we get then to talk about it. Or even better yet, set up performances in music which lean more in one direction than on the other. And I'll tell you one brief story about that. This goes back to again, I think early 90s, but you have to check the dates. But these were the moments when the possibility that Franz Schubert might have been gay first came up. And it was a very, very controversial position at the time. A lot of people were, and I must say, kind of homophobically resistant to this idea. We still don't actually know. The evidence is scanty. But one of Schubert's famous songs is called Ganymede. And it is a setting of a poem by Goethe, which describes the descent of the god Jupiter to bring the beautiful young boy Ganymede up to heaven with his cup there. And we took this song, and there was a meeting, it was sponsored by the Aston Magnet group, which also still exists and actually plays in my neck of the woods in upstate New York. And I had the opportunity to kind of coach two different performances of the same song by the same singer. One, which would be very chaste and not sexualized at all. And the other, which would be full on passionate absorption. And the interesting thing was that both performances were very convincing. So the really interesting lesson to be learned from that is that, first of all, you can think oppositionally and still at the same time acknowledge that the person across the aisle from you has a point worth listening to. And at the same time, that performance is everything. You have to make these things come true in the concert hall. And that certain kind of attention has to kind of be paid to the music to make that happen.
Yeah. And I especially like the fact that in your 1990 book, you actually focus first on music without words, without text. Mm-hmm. And if our principles can work here, then it can obviously work with music with text, as you just were telling.
Yeah, exactly. And doing it with music without text is indeed the very thing. In part because historically, the whole question of whether music did have such meaning arose in relation to textless instrumental music. That's its historical formation. Yeah. So we need to go back to that and we have to work the question out.
Sure. All right. I'd like to talk process just for a second. When you sit down to write a new piece, how do you begin? Are you at a piano, computer, blank manuscript page? How do you start?
Used to be piano, but I thought to myself that the advice that was always given to young composers about composing at the piano was true, that unless you're writing piano music, you shouldn't write it at the piano. Because if you do, you'll end up writing piano music for some. So I trained myself to basically work by imagining the music and then by writing it down. And only then, in the days before the software became available, would I try some things out at the keyboard, catch my mistakes, think of things that could be realized. But the essential thing was to hear the music first, write it down, and then worry about realizing the sound. And the same thing is true now that, of course, we have this wonderful software. And there are temptations there. I usually try to wait until a good portion of the piece is written before I hit playback. Out there first. And, then there's always the question of, okay, so this is how you imagined it. Is that the way it sounds? And happily, a lot of the time it is, but when it isn't, right, we learn from it. But, I think at the very beginning, it's just an idea of how you want the piece to go and on what instrument you want it to sound. Mm-hmm. And that's a work of imagination. It can, of course, be stimulated by thinking of the tune or a harmonic progression or something at the time. But often it just is there and comes in relationship to other things that one has done.
Yeah.
It's a mysterious process. I don't know. Love it, but I don't understand.
All right, I've got one more question for you before we take a quick break. If you could go back in time and give your 18-year-old self one piece of advice, what would it be?
Be bold and go into music instead of going into English. Although I will say that being a literature professor has been very satisfying. But I'm not young, and I sometimes think that I missed out on a lot by waiting all those years before actually coming back to my first love. So at one level, I wouldn't change anything, but on the other, it's a nice path not taken to think about.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll listen to some of Larry's compositions. Welcome back. This is Steve Danielson. I'm talking today with Dr. Lawrence Kramer. So, Larry, we're going to start today first with a fragment from a Sappho from Part Songs. So this is for mixed chorus. And Part Songs is a collection of short, sort of miniature pieces, all of them fragments of text from different poets. So can you tell us more about writing Part Songs and how this fragment from Sappho fits in the whole collection?
Yes. The theme as well as the actual content of Part Songs is fragmentation. And the cycle begins with a moment in which music itself is breaking up. And it ends with a similar poem. So the real focus of this cycle is on the sense of transience, so things disappearing into historical time. So I use ancient texts as well as modern ones. And the emotional question that this little cycle, choral cycle, seeks to raise is, what can be retrieved? What can we hold on to? What can we have when all we have is fragments? And the answer is ultimately quite affirmative, but there's a certain amount of struggle involved. And the fragment from Sappho, I think, is a pivotal moment in the group because it is the most fragmentary of the song. And it breaks up in a real state of incompletion, which thus leaves something to be accomplished for the songs that come after. Because what the Sappho songs do is, with a kind of feeling, I hope, of beautiful remorse that more of this can't be retrieved, that this is all we have, a much greater whole that has been lost. But there's a promise there. We can only find a way to retrieve it. And that's where this song comes in. It marks that moment where one has to decide to go forward and find a way to appreciate the fragmentary without longing for anything new.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. So what would you say is the answer? What do we have when all we have is fragments?
Let me think about that a moment. That's, in a way, I was answering that question musically rather than conceptually. So I figured out myself. The last song is about the way in which music disappears. And the song discovers that the recollection of the fleeting of music can itself be expressed musically. So that by heightening the feeling that whatever else music may be, it is transient. It disappears in the act of its being made. If we can not only hear that happen, but reflect on it musically, then we can learn to appreciate all of that element of fleeting time and fleeting sensation and fleeting feeling without regret, even though we also understand that it carries a certain genuine melancholy along with it. And it's that balance between that appreciation and that melancholy that the cycle expressively seeks to accomplish in its final song. The penultimate song is a setting of the text by Walt Whitman, which raises the stakes considerably. The concluding image of that song is a raging sea seeking the shore with great urgency. And with a lot of feeling of impatience and desperation in that setting. And it's precisely that with the final song seeks to get beyond. But the basis in which all that happens becomes, I think, there for the listener to think about in the earlier Sappho fragment.
Excellent. All right. Well, we're going to listen to a fragment from Sappho, performed by C4, the Choral Composers and Conductors Collective. And just on a side note, Karen Siegel, who is one of the founders of C4, is in the soprano section. I interviewed her on season 3. So go back and listen to Karen as well. All right. So here is a fragment from Sappho. All right, our next piece today, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening for voice and piano. So I really enjoyed the sparse texture in the piano, creating the feel of this snowy evening. Was this part of a larger song cycle?
No, there's a story behind it. It's got a backstory.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I have been working on, I finished this about a year ago. I was working in the late 20-teens through the early 2020s on 2 collections of standalone songs called A Modern Song. And this was one of them. So this is a text or a song rather, which people are invited to pick and choose and make your own assembly. But there's a story behind it. So Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening is, of course, a famous poem by Robert Frost. And when the poem was in copyright, the Frost estate was very uncooperative about giving permission to set Frost's work. And early in my career, one of the pieces back that I did in the 1980s, which I kind of still acknowledge paternity of, is a song cycle based on some poems by Walt Whitman. I'm a big Whitman fan, and I have come to Whitman many times, but this was the first. But it wasn't supposed to be Whitman. It was supposed to be Robert Frost, and the tenor who commissioned the song got in touch with the estate of Frost and pleaded with them to allow us to do a group of Frost songs, including Stopping by Woods. And they absolutely wouldn't budge. They went to Whitman instead, happily out of copyright, and time went by. And on January 1st, 2019, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening came out of copyright. And I had prepared this event. I was working on the song, but I left it unfinished until January 1st, 2019. Finished the setting, and thus attempted to become the first composer to legitimately set Stopping by Woods without permission.
That's awesome. Yeah, I know several composers that had that same Robert Frost dilemma, but it's nice to know they're available now.
Yes, it certainly is. And thank you for the comment about the texture. That was a very critical element in the song. And I initially associated it with one of the lines in the poem in which Roth writes about his horse. He gives his harness bell to see if there's some mistake, and that the falling octaves in the beginning of the piano kind of reminiscent of that sound.
Okay.
A great deal happens after that, but it's very understated. The rhythmic displacements and various small changes that accumulate the song.
Okay. Well, we are now going to listen to Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, performed here by, you'll have to help me with this, Suni Afsi Gunther,
Uh,
and Joshua Groffman on piano.
Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village low. He will not see me stopping here to see his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the of easy wind and downy the woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep.
All right. We're going to turn next to your finale, to string quartet number 8, Reflections and Memories. So I thought it was interesting that you wrote this to actually describe the quartet for whom it was written, the Eurasia Quartet. So what qualities were you describing in this piece?
Well, the press of that, I actually have to talk a bit about the status of the finale, which is interesting, because I originally wrote it as a finale to a non-existent string quartet.
Oh, wow.
I always knew that it would be the finale to something, but I did not know to what. And a good number of years had to go by before I finally figured out how I could work that into a coherent four movement thinking. And so what I did was draw on memories that are very real to me, and both of them are kind of astronomical or cosmological. They have to do with experiencing nocturnal cloud formations and also constellations and the like. And I think that, a little bit of, at a little hint, a listener can usually hear that in the movie. So what happens is that the second and fourth movement, one becomes a more intense and expansive version of the other. So the vividness of memory establishes itself, and then at a later moment, it expands pretty much the way the night sky expands when you are watching it attentively. And its process is metaphorical, of course, but it has also got, I hope, certain evocativeness. Then, for the first and third movements, I put in to replace what I took to be the counterpoint of this act of recollection, remembering vivid sensory experiences of the external world. I moved into it, and I wanted to find a musical expression for processes of introspection, which were in search of meanings within the self. And what I did there is also create a kind of sequence in which the first reflection is relatively tranquil and thoughtful, but the second becomes somewhat troubled. And so you have this alternating pattern, right? A reflection and a vivid memory, and then a somewhat darker reflection, and then a memory which is even more vivid and more ebullient than the first. So that the fast movements, the memory movements, become a way of resolving the difficulties, the perplexities, the dark introspection of the reflection. And so the finale just goes all out.
Well, I think that's great. It sounds like how I wrote my dissertation as well. I started with the conclusion and then worked backwards from there. All right. Well, we are going to listen to the finale, Reflections and Memories, performed here by the Eurasia Quartet. All right, our last piece today, Elegy from Outcry and Elegy for Unaccompanied Violin. So on the recording you sent me, you gave an introduction that you said gives as good a description of this piece as could be desired. So we're going to go ahead and listen to your description from that video first, and then we will listen to Elegy performed by Claudia Scher on violin.
Something similar happens in the second movement, but the similarity is inflected by the memorial goal of the second movement, the elegy, which is meant to reckon with the terrible human cost of the year 2020, or, for that matter, through to 2021, because that promise is still just a promise and no more. But in any case, the movement does seek a point of understanding that will place the human cost of this experience that we all share in some kind of perspective. The movement consists essentially of the repetition of a single rhythmic figure, easily recognized. And the repetition of that figure rhythmically is inexorable and steady. But in order to acknowledge the individuality of each moment of commemoration, the piece is so designed so that virtually none of those various repetitious statements is the same as any of the others. So one does get a feeling of a shared fate. Everybody is encapsulated in the same framework, but a fate which sounds different for each individual who is affected by it, who is extinguished by it. And that is the way in which the piece moves. It's like the memorial act of reading the names of the lost. Now, as I realized as I was composing this piece that I was indebted, as one always is when writing a piece for solo stringed instrument, to Bach, in particular to the emotional intensity and quality of the first movement of the third partita. So the piece begins by actually quoting that piece by Bach and then going in its own way to find the individuality of those whose loss it seeks to commemorate. And as it does so, gradually to evolve that moment of summation or consummation, which will invest or hopes to invest these events and these responses to them with whatever meaning that they can bear. Up to you how much and how full that meaning may be. And so that's how the piece sounds to me. It's an emotional journey. I hope that you will find it a valuable thing to share it with me and with Claudia as she plays the piece. And I will now turn you over to her with a note of thanks. These activities, musical activities, as I'm sure you know, are all intensely collaborative. Claudia made some great suggestions during the course of this piece. So I'm very happy to turn it over to her for this performance of Akraya Elegy.
Well, Larry, what are you working on now that you can tell us about?
Well, what I'm working on now is a chamber opera, um, which is a new departure for me, and I think I needed one. So it's a chamber opera which has two distinct elements to it. It's meant to be really performable. So a small ensemble, just five instruments and three voices, with minimum props and things like that. So it's just a piece that if people like it and if I ever finish it, I mean this is brand new. It's only like 2 of 9 acts or 9
Uh-huh.
scenes so far. That it can be staged economically, and I
Okay.
think that's really important in a world where it's difficult to get any kind of opera put on a stage, in particular if there's a big production. And the Met has not come calling. You need to be practical. The other thing is that I wanted this to be an opera with historical interest, but also contemporary resonance. And here I have to be not aggressively, I hope, but kind of upfront about my own political views. Uh, this is an opera about how lies become truth. And it is based on the life of Nietzsche. And it dramatizes the relationship of Nietzsche with the two women who were pivotal in his development. One was Lou Andreas Salome, remarkable woman who eventually became a psychoanalyst and Ruth Glory. He was also the lover of the poet Lana Maria Rilke before that. And Nietzsche was in some way or other in love with Lou. And that brought him in conflict with the other woman in question, which is his sister, Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche. And the opera dramatizes the way in which these relationships evolve and decay. And in particular, the relationship between Elizabeth and Friedrich, because it is Elizabeth who was a fascist, who managed for close to half a century represent successfully her brother as the two things he most loathed, a German nationalist and an anti-Semite. And this all happened after Nietzsche's collapse in 1889, when, for reasons that remain unknown, he broke down and entered a kind of semi-conscious state, which persisted for the remaining 11 years of his life. And if I'm lucky and if this goes well and if the composition goes well, the opera ends with a kind of grand monologue in which Nietzsche in the asylum has a kind of awakening and reviews the entire experience of his life and still finds a way to affirm it despite the tragic and fateful event, and to recover the truth, at least for himself, that his sister has stolen from him. I haven't written any of that yet, but I know how I plan to.
There you go.
And with luck, this will come together over the next couple of years.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll look forward to it. Well, if our listeners want to listen to more of your music, find out more about you, where should they go online?
They can go to SoundCloud. I have a page on SoundCloud, and there is a website, lkmusic.org, which they can also go to, even at the time. And that's it, basically. Although there's some things on YouTube, too. And I think the website will lead you to that. Just a quick ride through Google will get you to this place.
All right. Well, hey, listeners out there, we are now 3 episodes into season 7 of Moveable Dough. Have you gotten a Moveable Dough t-shirt, a hoodie? How about a sticker? If you listen to more than just this episode, then you obviously like the show. Let people know by getting something with the Moveable Dough logo on it to show everybody around you that you're a fan. You can even get the ridiculously amazing Moveable Doughboy t-shirt. Visit sdcompose.com/moveabledough or follow the link in the show notes. Well, Larry, it has been a pleasure to talk to you today. Thank you so much for joining me on Moveable Dough.
Thank you very much for having me, Steve.
My guest today was composer Dr. Lawrence Kramer. If you have a recommendation for a future guest or an idea for the show, please email me at moveabledough@gmail.com. This is Steve Danielson. Keep the music moving.